Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and I'm going to start in just a few minutes. We'll give people a chance to gather. I'll just give one more minute and then we can begin. All right, why don't we get started? Hello, everyone, again. My name is Andy Davis, and on behalf of our team here at Expert Legal Language, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Bridging the Legal Language Gap, a checklist for drafting in English as a foreign language. We're coming to you today from a fairly nice autumn day in New York City. And we hope that wherever you are in the world, you've been having a good day so far. Some of you may be starting your day as we are here. For others, you may be joining us on your lunch break, in which case we thank you for the company. And for some of you in further time zones, it might be the end of the day, but wherever you are, we thank you for being here and we hope to make this moment worthwhile for you. I'll give you just a brief rundown before we begin. I'm going to be presenting for about 20 to 25 minutes, after which there'll be an opportunity to address your questions. So if in the course of the presentation you have a question, I'd like to encourage you to drop it in the Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. With that said, just give me a moment to share my screen. Okay, oops, just a moment. Let me try to share this. Okay, I hope that you can see my screen here. Again, this webinar is called Bridging the Legal Language Gap, a checklist for drafting in English as a foreign language. Now, you may be wondering what even is the value of a checklist like this. After all, your English is already pretty good. In fact, for many of you, being able to speak and write English at a very high level was a prerequisite for being hired at your job. I'm speaking English to you right now, and presumably you're understanding me just fine. So why would you even need a checklist? Well, from our perspective, the purpose of a checklist, especially one of fundamentals like this, is to minimize harm. A checklist can help you bridge the legal language gap between your already strong English and an even better, more polished presentation. It can help you to avoid the kinds of tiny mistakes that distract from an otherwise excellent work product, and it allows you to reflect in English the same high quality of professionalism and expertise that you do when practicing law in your own language. In other words, it can save you from harming your reputation or your business or your client's business. Before we jump in, I just want to point out that all of the examples that I'm about to share with you today have been taken directly from actual writing samples of attorneys whom we've worked with around the world over the years. And for those who might not know, at Expert Legal, we specialize in customized courses that use attorneys' own writing samples as the course materials. And I'll say a little bit more about that towards the end of the presentation, but for now, I just want to point this out so that you know that if ever you're feeling a little bit unsure about your English, especially on those tiny details, you are definitely, as these examples will show, not alone. Okay, so that being said, let's jump right into it. A checklist for drafting in English as a foreign language. Number one, are my prepositions correct? Prepositions, my friends, are small but deadly. The wrong preposition can distract from your messaging and from your advice, or even derail it altogether. And the hard part about prepositions, and the reason that they're the bane of the existence of so many non-Anglophones, English speakers, is that there really aren't any hard and fast rules that you can master. You just have to practice them and become more familiar with which preposition goes where. So let's look at a couple of examples. Here's a sentence: despite of the fact that the company controls the price. I think here what the speaker meant, what the writer meant to say was either despite the fact that the company controls the price, or in spite of the fact that the company controls the price. Either one of those would have been correct. Despite of, we don't say it in English. Here's another one. We have agreed a settlement. In English, would we say this? No. Now, I know that in some Romance languages, French, for example, it is possible to say the equivalent of this sentence in French. We have agreed a settlement. In English, you must either agree to something or agree on something. Now, you can say we have agreed as a full sentence in itself, but if you're using agreed in the middle of a sentence, and you're going to describe an object that's been agreed to or agreed on, you have to use one of those two prepositions, either to or on. And one more small detail that I'd like to point out here is that there is a slight difference in nuance between agreeing to something and agreeing on something. So in this example here, we have agreed to a settlement. The nuance emphasizes the fact that you have agreed. If you say we have agreed on a settlement, there's a slight shift in understanding that you're now about to describe perhaps the terms of that settlement. So agreed to and agreed on are in the same family and mean generally the same thing, but have slight differences in nuance, all because of that tiny two-letter preposition. So something to keep in mind there. Okay, next item. Did I use the right singulars and plurals? Now, this is important because in some cases, a word that can be used in the plural in your language of origin is only ever used in the singular in English, and vice versa. For example, the client has requested our advices for complying with this regulation. In this case, would we use advices in the plural? No. Singular only. The client has requested our advice for complying with this regulation. There are words like this in English that, even though they may be said in the plural in your language, for example, if you're describing multiple items, in English, it's only ever used in the singular. The documents are described in details below. Should that be singular or plural for details? It should only be in the singular, in detail below. Now, if you wanted to say below are the details of these documents, that's fine. But for the phrase in detail is only ever used in the singular. But what about this one? He terminated the arrangement on the ground of breach of contract. This is not correct. In English, when you use the word ground in the singular, it's meant to refer to the actual ground, the physical ground, the soil. What this writer probably meant to say is he terminated the arrangement on the grounds of breach of contract. So pay attention as you're drafting to your singulars and plurals and see what applies in English as opposed to perhaps in your own language. Next, are my articles in the right place? And here we're referring to either definite articles like the or indefinite articles like a or an. And this is similar to the singular plural question because in certain words, in English, certain words are used with articles and some don't take articles, even though they might in your language. For example, the company has been involved in a litigation against its competitor for years. Here we would not use the a. We would just say in litigation against its competitor for years. And generally speaking, when you're referring to abstract nouns or in some cases collective nouns, they tend not to take indefinite articles like a or an. However, watch what happens when we change the word litigation to lawsuit. They mean the same thing. So would we say the company has been involved in a lawsuit against its competitor for years? Yes, we would. A lawsuit, but only litigation. And why is this? Well, a lawsuit in this case refers to a specific lawsuit. Litigation, by contrast, refers to the general abstraction of litigation. They mean the same thing, but a lawsuit takes an article, litigation does not. Something to keep in mind when you are drafting. Next, am I using English syntax? A syntax is the order in which words typically appear in a sentence. So when writing in English, ask yourself, am I using the word order that's familiar from my own language, or am I actually using English syntax? And let me show you some examples of what we call imported syntax. The corporate group to which belongs the company. Now this sentence, I think, was taken from one of our students from a Portuguese-speaking country. We wouldn't use this syntax. What we're more likely to say, or what we would say, is the corporate group to which the company belongs. This pattern of placing the noun after the verb, which is quite common in some Romance languages, for example, Spanish and Portuguese, is called a reversal. And even though I personally think it's beautiful and poetic, it does not belong in English, unless you're writing poetry, which most of us are not at work generally. Here's another one that's slightly less egregious. We must within 3 weeks accomplish this. Again, the speaker will, the reader will understand what you're trying to say, but it's just a little bit distracting in terms of syntax. What we're more likely to say is, we must accomplish this within 3 weeks. Now, another form of syntax I want to bring to your attention is that of punctuation. Punctuation really matters. Let's take these two sentences as an example. Our work done in English is of high quality, or our work, comma, done in English, comma, is of high quality. Now, both of these sentences are technically correct. Syntactically, they're correct, but the syntax makes them mean two different things. The first sentence means our work done in English is of high quality, means that only, the implication is only our work that's done in English is of high quality. Our work done in German, maybe, maybe not. On the other hand, when you add the commas, the meaning changes. Our work, comma, done in English, comma, is of high quality. The implication here is that our work is of high quality, and we want to emphasize that it's done in English. So two different meanings, decide which one applies to you, but pay attention to how punctuation affects the syntax and the meaning of what you write. Next, very important, is my terminology accurate? And here you need to pause and ask yourself, am I using any false cognates? Am I using a word that appears to me that's similar to a word in my language that means the right thing, but means something different in English? Beware of false friends, my true friends. And here are some examples. The first is taken from Spanish, hipoteca, which, though it looks like the word hypothesis, in fact means mortgage. The second example in French, fourniture, looks a lot like furniture, but it means office supplies. Very different thing, potentially very different price point. So beware of false friends. Here's an example of terminology that's used in a way that's different and awkward from the way we would use it in English. So the first sentence says, under the agreement, the parties abdicate their privilege against self-incrimination. In English, when we speak of abdication, we either are speaking of a queen or king choosing to abandon the throne, or we may speak of abdicating responsibility for a task or an undertaking. I think what this person should have said was, under the agreement, the parties waive their privilege against self-incrimination. In other words, they choose not to exercise that privilege. They waive it, but they don't abdicate it. Here's another example. The tax regime applicable for Mexican companies. The word regime is a bit of a red flag here because in English, it's typically used to describe a government or a political party of some kind, and there's typically a negative connotation to the word regime. I think that the original drafter didn't intend necessarily a negative connotation. What they really meant to say was the tax system or the tax scheme applicable, and pay attention to the preposition here, to, not for, Mexican companies. A system or a scheme just meaning the body of tax law and policy applicable to Mexican companies. So we wouldn't use the word regime there. So it's important to pay attention to your terminology and watch out for either false cognates or words that have a slightly different nuance or connotation in English. And finally, after all of this is said and done, you've gone through this checklist, you need to sit back and ask yourself, is my writing unambiguous? Have I been crystal clear in my advice, in my analysis, and in my guidance to the reader or to your listener? Let's look at some examples of ambiguity. Here's a sentence. Article 5 prohibits this transaction, so we will have to revise it. Now, this is ambiguous. Why? Because we don't know what it is we have to revise. Is it Article 5 or is it the transaction? Now, I use this example because for those of you coming from Romance languages, in many Romance languages, the word article takes a masculine gender, but the word transaction takes a feminine gender. And for those people, the word it will signal the gender to which the word applies. It would either be in French, for example, le or la, which would signal which of these items, the article or the transaction, needs to be revised. So you have a bit of a shortcut in a gendered language that you lose when you translate that sentence into English. In English, you would have to make clear which of these items would need to be revised, whether the article or the transaction. So if you're coming from a gendered language, it's something to keep in mind when you're translating your work into English. Here's another form of ambiguity. The company was able to cut costs by $3 million in 2020 and 2021. Why is this ambiguous? Because we don't know whether that's one $3 million cut over the course of 2 years, or whether it was $3 million in 2020 and $3 million in 2021. How can we fix this? Well, it depends on what we mean. If it's one cut over that period, we can say the company was able to cut costs by $3 million over, here's the preposition again, over the 2020 to 2021 period. But what if we mean it the other way? What if we mean that there were two $3 million cuts in those 2 years? We can say, in that case, the company was able to cut costs by $3 million each in 2020 and 2021. And that way we remove all ambiguity, and it's very clear whether we're talking about $3 million over 2 years or $6 million. Okay, let's recap now. And here is your checklist. Number 1, are my prepositions correct? My tiny, small, but deadly hurdles that can derail my otherwise perfect document. Next, did I use the right singulars and plurals, keeping in mind that some words that take a plural perhaps in your language of origin wouldn't do so in English, and vice versa. Similarly, are my articles in the right place? Have I used an indefinite article when I shouldn't have? Am I using English syntax, or have I imported a familiar syntax from my own language, keeping in mind that punctuation also affects the syntax of your work? Is my terminology accurate? Am I using a false cognate, or am I using the terminology as it is understood and applied in English? And finally, have I been completely clear? Is my writing unambiguous? Does my reader or my listener fully understand exactly what I'm trying to say in all its nuances and what to do next? So my friends, that's your checklist of fundamentals. I thank you so much for listening. And now I think I have, there's an opportunity to take any questions. So let's see if there are any questions to be had. Does anyone have any questions? No, is this all clear to everyone? Does anything occur to anyone? Nope, I see no questions. I think that's a good sign. I hope that you found this useful and valuable. And for those of you who are interested in learning more, I'd like to invite you to our next webinar, which is taking place on Thursday, November 6th at this same time. And in that one, we'll be discussing how to reduce jargon and to build a better understanding with your English language clients. We call it lawyering without legalese. And frankly, this is a webinar that even native English speakers could attend, because as lawyers, we often rely on legalese and unnecessarily stilted language to get our point across. But we want to encourage you and teach you how to write in a more fluid, natural, concise, and minimalist way. So I hope you'll join us for that one. In the meantime, if you are interested in learning more about us, I encourage you to visit our website at expertlegallanguage.com. Thanks so much for being here today. My name is Andy Davis, and on behalf of all of us at Expert Legal, thanks very much. Goodbye.